etc. But whether it's President Johnson and the Gulf of Tonkin compared to false claims of WMDs, the similar ignorance of Vietnam in the 1950s and 1960s to ignorance of Afghanistan and Iraq in the past decade, the lack of legitimacy of the groups and peoples the United States supported, the length of guerrilla wars. George Herring has to change the title of his book. Does that next edition.
That's why he doesn't want to do it.
Right. Or the stalemate in the fighting. There are many useful parallels. What's illuminating to me was the impact of the Vietnam War on decision making. I disagree slightly with David Anderson here. I mean, I do agree that they ignored most of everything, but they didn't ignore everything about Vietnam. Well, Bush administrations, as David has already noted, consistently rejected any comparisons. Bush himself, when he came back from one of his surprise trips to Iraq at the news conference, was asked directly about the comparison to Vietnam, and he gave a very long, deep answer, no. When asked if there were any parallels, right, and he moved on. The Vietnam War didn't influence Bush's wars. First, it did so by helping to shape neoconservative thinking, a link that I think could be brought out a little more. Right, and the conclusions they had, as David's cartoon illustrated, that the mistake was getting out, not staying the course, not using American power effectively, and so in Vietnam, and how that influenced them. Second, and more directly, thinking about Vietnam influenced how they approached the war in terms of the size of the force that the United States committed. And here you get a direct rejection of the PAL doctrine and the different sets of conclusions about the lessons of the Vietnam War that guided Bush 41 in the Persian Gulf War compared to Bush 43 later. The fact that they did not want to draft, they did not want to ask for those direct sacrifices at home, were all came out of their understanding of Vietnam. Terry Anderson makes what I think was a very telling comparison at one point here between Franklin Roosevelt's post-Pearl Harbor speech, his call for sacrifice, determination, unity, and noting the high costs that would come to the American public in pursuing the war, to Bush's telling people to go on vacation and shopping after 9/11. Right? They did not want the protests of the Vietnam War, and they constructed policies to try to avoid that as much as possible. At the same time, they were saying it was never going to be a long war anyway, which really raises a question of how much they did believe that, given some of the ways they constructed it. But the size of force was an important factor, as Anderson clearly demonstrates, in the failures of Bush's policies in both Afghanistan and Iraq. It was also linked to the administration's determination for over 3 years not to escalate and thus create an impression of stalemate and quagmire. It was not until 2007, after the shellacking, as Bush put it, in the 2006 congressional elections and the firing of Donald Rumsfeld, that Bush implemented the strategy of the surge to change the course of the fighting in Iraq. Anderson's discussion of the surge is focused, rightly so, on the counterinsurgency ideas of General David Petraeus and the implementation and impact of that policy. What should be highlighted more, maybe, was the purpose of the surge, which was to stabilize the situation and allow the United States to stay. Right? That's what the surge was about. It was just to hang on. Right? It wasn't going to win in and of itself. And the importance of this, I think, is twofold. First, it raises the question of how to end wars of intervention where the United States is supporting unpopular regimes, finds itself in the midst of civil wars, and can only achieve a stalemate at best on the battlefield. And here comparisons to Vietnam for the situation in both Iraq and Afghanistan and the unnecessary continuation of the fighting would be fruitful for analysis. Second, similar to Tom Ricks's The Gamble, that focuses on the surge, Anderson gives Ambassador Ryan Crocker the last word on the surge, noting that it was just the end of the first chapter of a very long book, and that, quote, the gains are fragile and they are tenuous. This last idea, fragile and reversible, is a common mantra still from civilian and military officials alike, and was the subject of much discussion at the most recent Society of Historian American Foreign Relations meeting in June. That Crocker should have the last word is fine, in particular because he's a Whitman College graduate, but they need to be contrasted to and used to counter the claims of Bush and his supporters now, that we hear now that the surge was victory. and that Bush, in fact, did achieve his goals in Iraq. This is one area of summation and evaluation that I wanted more from Terry Anderson in the book. But Terry Anderson's outstanding history of the Bush administration's wars provides ample material for those who wish to place these two wars, not just to understand them, but to also into the discussions of questions of empire, continuity versus change in American foreign policy, and what the end of the Cold War has meant for U.S. relations with the world, especially its response to instability and unrest in post-colonial states. While Anderson does not directly address these questions, nor should he have, this is not a criticism, his work does raise the issues of the meaning of globalization, the unipolar world, and what, as Paul Kennedy noted back in the 1980s, imperial overstretch and relative decline. Another way of asking this is to compare the rhetoric, ideology, and policies of the United States in the 1890s and early part of the 20th century to the post-Cold War years. Well, there's not a straight and certainly not the only path. The line, I think, is still discernible, as was discussed by some in the panel yesterday on Latin America and the Cold War. Right, and the topic maybe for next year's program, given the theme. Right, did the Cold War then merely mask many of the structural, ideological, economic, and geopolitical strategies and directions of American foreign policy? Certainly, Anderson's work compares favorably and provides support for other recent scholarship, such as, among others, Chalmers Johnson's Blowback Trilogy and Andrew Bashevik's recent books on U.S. foreign policy. In the process, it challenges the way we periodize and how we think about change and continuity in American foreign policy. Terry Anderson has set the bar high, and his Bush's wars will set the terms of discussion of these wars for a long time. We are all deeply indebted to him for this fine work that will shape and influence scholarship and teaching of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq for decades to come. Thank you.